I had $12 million sitting safely in a trust fund, and I chose to sleep in my car. I walked away from a wedding, from a home, from a life that looked perfect on the outside. For 30 days, I let the world believe I was broke, unwanted, and lost, because I needed to know who loved me when I had nothing left to offer. Before I begin, if you've ever stayed in a place where you weren't valued because leaving felt scarier than being invisible, please leave a comment, and subscribe to Voice of Legends. The night I decided to become homeless, my fiancé was explaining to his brother why I wasn't exactly financially ambitious. He didn't know I was standing in the hallway, just out of sight, holding a tray of glasses I had just washed. The house was full of soft yellow light and catered food, the kind of gathering meant to celebrate our upcoming wedding. People were laughing in the living room. Someone had opened a second bottle of wine. From the outside, it looked like the beginning of a beautiful life. Inside that hallway, something inside me shifted. "It's not that she's lazy," Daniel said, his voice casual, almost kind. "She just doesn't have that drive, you know? She's comfortable. Some people are fine being average." Average. I had heard versions of that word my entire life. Safe, practical, predictable. I was an accountant for a regional firm in Chicago, steady and dependable. I paid my bills on time. I kept emergency savings. I didn't gamble. I didn't chase trends. I believed stability was something to be proud of. But Daniel's family measured worth differently. His father owned a chain of medical supply companies. His sister was a corporate attorney. Ambition in their world was loud and visible. It came with new cars every 2 years and vacations announced on social media. I stood there long enough to hear his brother chuckle. "Well, at least she's not after your money." Daniel laughed softly. "No, she's not that type." I set the glasses down in the kitchen sink without making a sound. My chest felt tight, not exactly with anger, but with something heavier, a realization that I had been shrinking myself for someone who already saw me as small. That same week, 3 days before my 33rd birthday, I received a call from an attorney in Denver. His name was Harold Whitaker. His voice was careful, almost rehearsed. "I'm calling regarding your grandfather, Thomas Whitaker." I hadn't spoken to my grandfather in nearly a decade. He and my father had fallen out over business disagreements when I was in college. I was quietly instructed to keep my distance. I obeyed, the way I always did. "I'm afraid he passed away last month. You are the sole beneficiary of his estate." The number he said next didn't register at first. $12 million. It didn't feel like money. It felt like a mistake. I actually laughed, a sharp, nervous sound. "I think you have the wrong person." "I assure you, Miss Whitaker, I do not." The following week unfolded in a haze of paperwork and confidentiality agreements. The inheritance was tied up in conservative investments, real estate, and a trust that would shield my name from public record. My grandfather apparently had been far wealthier than any of us knew. I didn't tell Daniel. I told myself I needed time to process it, that it wasn't about secrets. It was about understanding what this meant. But the truth was more complicated. I wanted to see if anything around me changed without the influence of money. It did. Not because of the inheritance, because of that word, average. The next argument came over something small. It always does. I suggested postponing our honeymoon to save for a down payment on a larger home. Daniel stared at me like I'd suggested we sell his car. "We can afford it. You just think small." Think small. I began to notice how often he said things like that, how often his mother praised women who elevated their husbands, how often conversations about our future included his growth, his investments, his legacy. My role was supportive, stable, background. A week later, I found emails on Daniel's laptop. I wasn't snooping. He had asked me to send a document and the email tab was already open. There was a thread between him and a colleague named Marissa. It wasn't explicit, but it was intimate. Late-night messages, inside jokes, complaints about me framed as concern. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm settling," he had written. That was the sentence that did it. Not anger, not tears, just clarity. I closed the laptop gently. I walked into the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. I didn't see average. I saw a woman who had bent herself into smaller shapes to be easier to love. And suddenly, I didn't want to be easy anymore. The inheritance settled officially 2 weeks later. The funds were secured. The trust was active. $12 million, quietly waiting. The night before my birthday, Daniel told me he thought we should sign a prenuptial agreement. His tone was logical, rehearsed. "It's just practical given my family's assets." I nodded slowly. "Of course." He looked relieved. He didn't ask about my assets. He didn't imagine I had any worth protecting. That was when the idea formed. If he believed I was average, what would he do if I had nothing at all? On my birthday, I told him I'd been laid off. I made it believable. My firm had recently downsized. My performance reviews were solid, but I said my department was cut. Daniel blinked. "Wait, what?" "I didn't want to tell you until I knew what my options were." He paced the living room, not angry, just inconvenienced. "This is bad timing, Claire. The wedding deposits are non-refundable." I watched him carefully. "I have some savings, but I might need help for a month or two." There it was, the test. He hesitated. Not long, but long enough. "Well, maybe we should pause the wedding until you're back on your feet. It's just smarter." Pause. 2 days later, his mother called to express her concern. She asked if I had considered moving back with my parents. She used the word burden gently, like a suggestion. Within a week, Daniel suggested I move out temporarily. "Just until you're back on your feet," he said. "It'll reduce stress for both of us." Reduce stress. I packed 2 suitcases. I told him I didn't want to go to my parents. I needed space to think. He didn't argue. What he didn't know was that I owned 3 properties through my grandfather's estate. What he didn't know was that I could have bought the house we were living in outright. What he didn't know was that I was choosing this. I sold my car quietly and transferred the funds into a separate account. I placed the rest of my accessible cash into the trust under strict instructions. I kept only what I would have realistically had if I were truly unemployed. Then I rented a small storage unit and placed my belongings inside. For the first night, I slept in my car in a grocery store parking lot on the edge of town. The irony wasn't lost on me. $12 million, and I was brushing my teeth in a gas station bathroom. But for the first time in years, my chest felt light. I wasn't shrinking anymore. I was observing, and the next 30 days would show me exactly who Daniel was and who I had become. The first morning I woke up in my car, I didn't know where to look. The windows were fogged from my breath, and for a few disoriented seconds, I forgot why I was there. Then the ache in my neck reminded me. I had folded the back seats down and laid a thin camping pad across the trunk space. It was practical, not comfortable, but survivable. I sat up slowly and wiped a small circle in the condensation with my sleeve. The grocery store parking lot was already coming to life. Carts clattered, a delivery truck reversed with a sharp beeping sound. No one paid attention to the silver sedan parked near the edge of the lot. I was invisible. The strange thing was, I didn't feel afraid. I felt alert, present in a way I hadn't been in years. When you strip away comfort, you become aware of everything: the temperature of the air, the stiffness in your joints, the way people glance past you without really seeing you. I drove to a public park and washed my face in the restroom sink. I had chosen clothes carefully the night before, neutral, clean, nothing that suggested desperation. I didn't want pity. I wanted truth. Daniel texted mid-morning. "Have you found a place yet?" No good morning, no how did you sleep, just logistics. I stared at the message longer than necessary before replying, still figuring it out. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Maybe check with your cousin Rachel or short-term rentals. Practical, efficient, detached. I remembered the way he used to hold my hand in crowded rooms, how he once drove across town at midnight because I mentioned craving pie. I tried to locate that man in his text messages and couldn't find him. By afternoon, I felt the quiet humiliation of needing somewhere to exist without being noticed. Libraries became my refuge. They were warm, silent, and forgiving. No one questioned why you sat for hours as long as you weren't disruptive. I opened my laptop and searched for temporary jobs, not because I needed income, but because I needed authenticity in this experiment. If I was going to do this, I would do it fully. Around 3 o'clock, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Marissa. I almost laughed. "Hey, Claire," her message read. "Daniel mentioned what happened. I'm so sorry. If you ever want to talk." The audacity of it stunned me. I imagined them discussing my unemployment over coffee. I imagined sympathy delivered with subtle satisfaction. I didn't respond. That night, I parked near a 24-hour gym I had just joined using the last of what would have been my realistic savings. Showers mattered, routine mattered. If I was going to sleep in my car, I would not let myself unravel. As I lay there, staring at the dark ceiling fabric inches from my face, memories surfaced. My grandfather's laugh, deep and sudden. The way he once told me when I was 12, "Claire, never let someone decide your value for you. Markets fluctuate. Character doesn't." At the time, I thought he was talking about stocks. Now I understood he meant people. On the 3rd day, Daniel called instead of texting. His voice sounded tired. "This is harder than I thought," he admitted. "My parents are asking questions." I leaned back in the driver's seat, watching the sky fade as the evening. "About what?" "About the wedding. About everything." He paused. "They're concerned." Concerned. I had learned that word meant inconvenience. "Are you?" I asked quietly. Silence stretched between us. "I just need stability, Claire. I've worked really hard to build momentum in my life. I can't afford setbacks right now." I let his words settle. I had been a setback, a variable, a risk. "I understand," I said. And I did. I understood that love, for him, was conditional on comfort. That realization hurt more than sleeping in a car. By the end of the first week, my body had adjusted to the discomfort, but my heart was still catching up. I began noticing how differently the world treated you when it sensed you had nothing. At a coffee shop, a barista's smile tightened when my card declined once before processing. A security guard followed me through a store when I lingered too long in an aisle. It wasn't dramatic, it was subtle, a shift in tone, a withdrawal of warmth. One evening, I ran into an old coworker, Leela, outside the library. She blinked in surprise. "Claire, I haven't seen you at the firm." I swallowed. I was laid off. The lie felt heavy, even though the circumstances were manufactured. Her face softened instantly. "Oh my gosh, are you okay?" It was the first time someone asked that question without calculation. My throat tightened unexpectedly. "I'm managing." She hesitated, then said, "I have a spare room. It's small, but you're welcome to it." No interrogation, no advice, just an offer. I almost broke right there on the sidewalk. I declined gently, telling her I didn't want to impose, but the offer itself warmed me more than a heated blanket could have. That night, I cried quietly in the driver's seat, Not because I was miserable, because kindness, when it's real, feels almost unbearable after you've braced yourself for rejection. On day 10, Daniel suggested we redefine our engagement. The word redefine sounded clinical, like editing a contract. Maybe we rushed into things, he said. This situation just highlights differences in long-term vision. Differences in vision. I pictured our future as he must have seen it, him ascending, me orbiting. Are you ending it? I asked. He exhaled slowly. I think it's best, for now. For now, there it was. No fight, no plea for us to weather it together, just retreat. I ended the call calmly, then set the phone down on the passenger seat and stared at the windshield for a long time. The pain wasn't explosive, it was quiet and final, like a door clicking shut. $12 million could have fixed this in an instant. One bank statement, one confession. But if money was the only thing that would make him stay, then I would have been marrying a transaction, not a partner. By the second week, something inside me steadied. The humiliation faded. In its place grew something stronger, self-trust. I began volunteering at a small community kitchen during lunch hours. It grounded me. The other volunteers didn't ask for resumes or explanations. They handed me an apron and showed me where the soup ladles were kept. Many of the people we served were truly homeless. Veterans, some single mothers, men who had once worn suits like Daniel's wore. Listening to their stories humbled me in ways I hadn't anticipated. My discomfort was chosen. Theirs was not. And yet some of them carried more dignity than anyone I'd met at Daniel's dinner parties. On the 15th night, as rain tapped against the car roof, I realized something unexpected. I didn't feel diminished. I felt sharpened, stripped of illusion. The test wasn't only revealing others, it was revealing me. I was capable of surviving discomfort. I was capable of walking away without spectacle. I was capable of choosing silence over revenge, and I hadn't even touched the $12 million. By the third week, I had memorized the rhythms of survival. Which grocery stores didn't tow overnight? Which gas stations had the cleanest restrooms? Which park benches caught the morning sun first? There's a strange intimacy that develops between you and a city when you no longer move through it with purpose, but with necessity. I had lived in Chicago for 8 years, and yet I was only now noticing the way the lake wind cut sharper before dawn, the way office towers hummed faintly at night like sleeping giants. Daniel hadn't called in 5 days. Not to check in, not to ask if I was safe, just silence. At first, I kept my phone volume high, as if missing a notification would mean missing proof that I had mattered. By day 18, I turned it to vibrate and stopped placing it face up. I told myself this was the point, this was the test, but knowing that didn't erase the ache. One afternoon, I drove past the house we had shared. I hadn't planned to. My body just turned the wheel almost instinctively. The curtains were open. I saw movement inside, Daniel crossing the living room with his phone pressed to his ear. The sight of him in that familiar space made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't prepared for. It wasn't jealousy, it was displacement. I had once believed that home was wherever we were together. Now I understood that I had mistaken proximity for partnership. I parked down the block and sat there longer than I should have. Eventually, the front door opened. Marissa stepped out, laughing at something Daniel had said behind her. She wore a soft gray coat and confidence that looked newly earned. He stood in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame, watching her walk to her car. He didn't look heartbroken. He looked relieved. I expected rage to rise inside me, or humiliation. Instead, there was a stillness, a final piece clicking into place. The engagement hadn't ended because I lost my job. It ended because I stopped being convenient. I drove away before they saw me. That evening, I returned to the community kitchen earlier than usual. I needed something tangible to do with my hands. The director, a woman named Mrs. Alvarez, handed me a stack of donation receipts to organize. She had kind eyes and a way of speaking that felt both firm and gentle. "You look tired today," she said quietly as we worked side by side. "Just adjusting," I replied. She studied me for a moment longer than was comfortable, then nodded. "Adjustment is where growth hides." Her words lingered with me long after I left. On day 21, I received an email from Daniel, not a text, an email. It was formal in tone, almost rehearsed. He hoped I was well. He thought it would be best to divide shared wedding expenses equitably. He attached a spreadsheet. I read it twice. There was no mention of Marissa, no acknowledgement of the emotional collapse of our future, just numbers. I almost laughed. For years, I had been the one who believed relationships weren't transactions, and here he was itemizing our love like a canceled conference. I responded simply. I agreed to the division. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't reveal that I could have written him a check that would cover not only his wedding, but his student loans and his parents' next investment property. I let him believe I was calculating how to survive. The truth was, I was calculating something far more important, who I would become after this. Physically, the strain was starting to show. My shoulders ached constantly. My sleep was shallow, broken by passing headlights and distant sirens. One particularly cold night, I woke with my teeth chattering, and for the first time, doubt crept in. What was I proving, and to whom? I could end this at any moment. I could book a hotel suite overlooking the lake. I could buy warmth, comfort, safety. But if I did, I would interrupt the clarity that had begun forming. So I stayed. On day 23, something unexpected happened. I ran into Daniel's mother at a grocery store. I was standing near the clearance section, calculating what would realistically fit into my limited food budget, when I heard my name. "Claire?" I turned slowly. Her eyes scanned me from head to toe, not cruelly, just assessing. I knew what she saw. Slightly rumpled coat, thinner face, exhaustion I couldn't fully hide. "Oh," she said softly. "I heard about your situation." I nodded. She shifted her purse on her shoulder. "Daniel's taking this very hard, you know." The words stunned me. "He is?" I asked quietly. "Yes, he feels blindsided. He says you changed." I swallowed. "Maybe I did." She sighed, lowering her voice. "Marriage requires equality, stability. It's difficult when one partner can't maintain their end." Maintain their end? I realized then that in her world, love was contingent on performance. If you faltered, you forfeited. "I hope he finds what he's looking for," I said calmly. Her expression flickered, confusion, maybe even a hint of disappointment that I wasn't pleading. "I hope you do too," she replied before walking away. That interaction hurt more than seeing Marissa, because it confirmed something I had long suspected. I had never been fully accepted. I had been evaluated. That night, instead of returning to the parking lot, I drove toward the lake. I parked near the shoreline and stepped out into the cold air. The city lights shimmered across the water. The wind bit at my cheeks. I thought about my grandfather, about the estate documents, about the letter he had left me which I hadn't fully opened yet. I had skimmed it in the attorney's office, but hadn't allowed myself to sit with it. Back in the car, under the dim glow of the interior light, I unfolded the letter completely. "Claire, if you're reading this, then I trust you've grown into the kind of woman who understands that money is not freedom. Choice is." My throat tightened. "I watched you as a child. You were always willing to give more than you received.
That's a beautiful trait, but it can become a cage if you're not careful. Tears blurred the ink. I'm leaving you this not so you can impress anyone, but so you can walk away when you need to. Walk away. The wind rattled the car slightly, but inside something settled. This month wasn't about punishing Daniel. It wasn't about testing loyalty alone. It was about proving to myself that I could survive without approval, that I could endure discomfort without bargaining away my dignity. On day 27, Lila called again. She didn't ask questions. She just invited me to dinner. I accepted this time. Her apartment was small but warm. She made pasta from scratch and insisted I take leftovers. We talked about everything except my situation. Books, childhood memories, ridiculous office gossip from years ago. One point, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Whatever you're going through," she said gently, "I hope you know you're more than it." No agenda, no transaction, just recognition. When I returned to my car that night, I realized something quietly profound. The people who valued me didn't need proof of my success, and the people who required it were never truly mine to begin with. 3 days remained in my self-imposed exile, and I already knew that when it ended, I wouldn't be returning to who I was before. I would be choosing something entirely different.
On the 30th morning, I woke before the sun. For a moment, I lay still in the back of my car, listening to the faint hum of early traffic beginning to stir in the distance. 30 days. The number felt both small and enormous. My body carried the evidence of it: tight muscles, thinner cheeks, a persistent ache behind my shoulders, but my mind felt clearer than it had in years. I didn't rush to end it. That surprised me most. There was no dramatic countdown, no triumphant sense of victory, just a quiet awareness that something fundamental inside me had shifted. I was no longer waiting for Daniel to call. I was no longer rehearsing explanations in my head. The version of me who would have begged to fix things had faded somewhere between cold nights and hard realizations. I drove to the lake one last time. The sky was pale gray, barely touched by morning light. I stepped out and wrapped my coat tighter around me, breathing in the sharp air. I thought about the house Daniel and I once planned to buy, the guest list we had argued over, the life that had looked stable on paper. And I felt free. Not vindicated, not superior. Free. Back in the car, I opened my phone and scrolled through old photos, engagement party smiles, vacation selfies, carefully staged moments. I studied my own face in those pictures. I could see now how often I had been performing reassurance, smiling just a little too brightly, leaning just a little too eagerly into him. I deleted nothing, but I no longer needed to revisit them. That afternoon, I met with Harold Whitaker's associate at a discreet downtown office. I hadn't told them about my experiment. They simply assumed I'd been considering next steps. When I stepped into the building, warm air enveloped me. The receptionist smiled politely, unaware that I had slept in my car the night before. The associate, a composed woman named Elise, reviewed the trust structure again. Investments were stable, dividends had quietly accumulated, real estate properties were managed through third-party firms. Everything was intact, waiting for instruction. "You're in a strong position," she said gently. "There's no urgency. You can take your time." Take your time. For so long I had lived under the pressure of proving myself, meeting expectations, keeping pace, not falling behind. Now, for the first time, I understood what it meant to move without panic. "I'd like to access one of the properties," I said calmly, "the townhouse on Maple Street." Elise nodded. "Of course." It was modest compared to the others, 2 bedrooms, quiet neighborhood, nothing extravagant. I had chosen it deliberately.
I didn't want spectacle, I wanted stability on my own terms. That evening, instead of returning to the parking lot, I drove to Maple Street. The house was exactly as the photographs had shown. Brick exterior, small porch, maple tree in the front yard just beginning to turn with the season. I sat in the driveway for a long time before getting out. My hands trembled slightly, not from cold this time, but from the weight of transition. When I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the silence felt different than the silence of my car. This was not survival. This was possibility. The rooms were empty except for basic staging furniture, clean lines, neutral walls, sunlight filtering through sheer curtains. I walked from room to room slowly, touching surfaces as if to confirm they were real. I didn't cry. Instead, I felt grounded. I took a long shower that night. I stood under the hot water until my muscles softened and the grime of parking lots and public restrooms washed down the drain. When I stepped out, wrapped in the towel, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked tired, but I also looked steady. Daniel called the next morning. I let it ring once before answering. "Claire," he said, his voice uncertain, "I've been thinking." I didn't respond immediately. I may have reacted too quickly. Maybe we can talk, figure things out. There it was. I imagined telling him everything, imagined the shock on his face, the recalibration, the sudden rediscovery of my value. But the clarity of the past 30 days held firm. "What changed?" I asked quietly. He hesitated. "I just miss you." I closed my eyes for a moment. "Do you miss me, or do you miss the version of me that made your life easier?" Silence. It stretched long enough to answer for him. "I don't think this is something we fix. I think it's something we learned from." His breathing shifted, frustration creeping in. "You're being dramatic." "No," I thought. "I'm being decisive." "I hope you find what you're looking for. Truly." I ended the call before my voice would waver. The final thread had been cut, not with anger, but with acceptance. Over the next week, I moved slowly into the townhouse. I kept my belongings minimal. I donated most of what was in storage. I wanted space, not clutter. Each object I chose to keep felt intentional. I returned to the community kitchen, this time not as someone passing through, but as someone planning. I asked Mrs. Alvarez if she would meet with me privately. We sat at a small folding table after lunch service. "I've been thinking about expanding operations," I began carefully. "More resources, more outreach." She raised an eyebrow. "With what funding?" I met her gaze steadily. "Mine." It wasn't a dramatic reveal. I didn't explain the inheritance in detail. I simply told her I had recently come into financial security and wanted to invest in something meaningful. She studied me for a long moment. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly. "I'm never more sure of anything." In the following days, we drafted plans, mobile food trucks, job placement programs, partnerships with shelters. I insisted on anonymity in public records. I didn't want my name attached to headlines. I wanted impact, not applause. At night, in the quiet of my new home, I thought about the 30 days behind me, about the cold mornings, the humiliation, the kindness of strangers, the indifference of someone I once planned to marry.
Settling into the townhouse didn't feel like an upgrade. It felt like a return to myself. The first week, I kept expecting a wave of indulgence to sweep over me, the urge to furnish every room at once, to celebrate, to prove something. But that impulse never came. Instead, I found comfort in small rituals, brewing coffee in my own kitchen, opening windows in the morning to let in crisp air, locking the door at night and knowing I had chosen this space without negotiation or compromise. I didn't announce my new address to anyone except Lila and the legal team managing the trust. My parents called once, vaguely referencing what they'd heard about the engagement ending.
I kept the explanation simple. It wasn't right, I said. That was enough. They didn't push. Our relationship had always functioned on the surface. We loved each other, but we avoided depth. At the community kitchen, however, depth was unavoidable. Mrs. Alvarez wasted no time putting me to work once we agreed on expansion plans. We held strategy meetings in the cramped back office, sketching out budgets and projections. I reviewed cost structures with the same meticulous focus I once reserved for tax audits. But this time, the numbers represented meals, transportation vouchers, counseling sessions, real outcomes. One afternoon, while reviewing grant applications, a man named Thomas came in seeking assistance. He was in his late 50s, clean-shaven but clearly worn down by something heavier than exhaustion. He explained quietly that he had lost his job after medical bills consumed his savings. Rent followed shortly after. His voice didn't tremble. He wasn't asking for sympathy, just direction. As I listened, something inside me tightened. 30 days in a car had unsettled me. 30 days without a safety net would have undone me entirely. We arranged temporary housing for him that same week through a partnership we'd just secured. As he left the office, he turned back and said, "Thank you for seeing me." Seeing me. The phrase lingered long after he walked out. I realized then that invisibility had been the most painful part of my experiment. Not the cold, not the discomfort, the way people looked past you when they believed you had nothing to offer. Daniel hadn't seen me. His family hadn't seen me. They had seen a variable in their equation. But here, in this modest building that smelled faintly of soup and disinfectant, I was seen. A month after moving into the townhouse, I received a wedding invitation in the mail. Daniel and Marissa. A small ceremony. Intimate venue. The date circled in elegant script. I stared at it longer than I expected. There was no surge of heartbreak, just a quiet recognition that timelines move on with or without us. I placed the invitation in a drawer, not out of bitterness, but as a reminder of how quickly conditional love can redirect itself. Later that evening, I walked through my neighborhood and noticed how ordinary everything felt. Children riding bicycles, a couple arguing softly on a porch, a dog barking at nothing in particular. Life, steady and indifferent. I felt grateful for the ordinariness. 2 weeks later, Lila came over for dinner for the first time. She stepped into the townhouse and paused, surprised. "This is yours?" she asked gently. "Yes." "How?" I considered my answer carefully. I'd kept my inheritance quiet, even from her, not because I didn't trust her, but because I needed to understand it myself first. I received something from my grandfather, an estate. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, but she didn't interrogate me. "That explains your calm," she said with a soft laugh. I shook my head. The calm didn't come from the money. She studied me for a moment, sensing there was more. So I told her, not every detail, but enough. The car, the 30 days, the test, Daniel's reaction, my choice not to reveal anything. When I finished, she was quiet. "That's the bravest thing I've ever heard," she said finally. I almost laughed. "Sleeping in a car?" "No," she replied. "Walking away when you had the power to make him stay." Her words struck deeper than she knew. Power had always felt abstract to me, something other people wielded confidently. But now I understood that power wasn't forcing outcomes, it was choosing integrity over leverage. As the nonprofit expanded, so did my involvement. We secured a second location across town, we hired 2 social workers, we launched a pilot job training program. I kept my name off press releases, but word spread quietly among local networks about a private donor committed to sustainable support. One evening, Mrs. Alvarez pulled me aside. "You're changing this place," she said softly. "No," I replied, "we are." She smiled. "Still, not everyone with means chooses this." I thought about that later, sitting alone in my living room. The house was furnished now, simple pieces, warm lighting, bookshelves slowly filling. It felt lived in, not staged. I opened my grandfather's letter again. "Money amplifies who you already are," he had written. "If you are generous, it will make you more so. If you are fearful, it will magnify that too." I considered the past months, the temptation to reveal my wealth out of pride, the restraint I had practiced instead, the quiet investments in people who would never know the source. Money had not changed my character, it had tested it. One afternoon, unexpectedly, Daniel showed up at the community kitchen. I recognized him immediately, standing uncertainly near the entrance. He looked around, slightly uncomfortable. When our eyes met, surprise flickered across his face. "Claire, I didn't know you worked here." "I volunteer," I replied evenly. He glanced at the bustling room. "I heard about this place. Marissa's firm is partnering with a few local charities." Of course they were. He shifted awkwardly. "You look different." "Different how?" "Stronger," he admitted. I held his gaze calmly. For a moment, I wondered if he sensed something deeper, if he felt the shift in dynamic without understanding its cause. "I'm glad you're doing well," he said finally, "and I hope you are too." There was nothing left to resolve. As he walked away, I felt no urge to stop him, no desire to correct the narrative. The test had already delivered its verdict long ago. That night, sitting on my porch beneath the maple tree, I reflected on the strange path that had brought me here, homeless by choice, wealthy in secret, heartbroken but not broken. The 30 days stripped away illusions. What remained was something quieter and far more durable, self-respect. And for the first time, I understood that security isn't about what you own, it's about what you're willing to walk away from.
The months after Daniel's visit unfolded without drama, and that, more than anything, felt like proof that I had stepped into a different season of my life. There were no grand confrontations, no attempts at reconciliation, no sudden revelations splashed across social media, just steady progress, quiet work, intentional choices. The nonprofit grew in ways that felt organic rather than explosive. We didn't chase headlines. We built infrastructure. We partnered with local clinics to provide basic healthcare screenings. We secured discounted transit passes for clients who found work but struggled to commute. Every improvement was small enough to manage, large enough to matter. And with each step, I felt less like someone recovering from heartbreak and more like someone constructing something durable. One afternoon, Mrs. Alvarez asked if I would consider stepping into a more formal leadership role. Not publicly, she clarified. Operationally, strategically. I hesitated. The old version of me would have deferred, worried about appearing presumptuous. The woman who had slept in her car for 30 days understood something different. I didn't need to minimize myself to be liked. "I'll do it," I said simply. That decision marked another quiet turning point. I began restructuring budgets, implementing accountability systems, ensuring that growth didn't outpace sustainability. My accounting background, once dismissed as average, became the backbone of our stability. For the first time, my skill set wasn't something to apologize for, it was an asset. Meanwhile, Daniel's wedding date came and went. I knew because Lila mentioned seeing photos online. I didn't look them up. I didn't need to. Whatever closure I might have once sought through comparison had already been replaced by something steadier. Instead, that weekend, I helped coordinate the launch of our mobile food unit. It wasn't glamorous, just a refurbished truck painted a hopeful shade of blue, but it represented months of planning. When we drove it into a neighborhood that lacked grocery access, people lined up quietly, patiently, not for charity, for relief.
As I handed a bag of fresh produce to an elderly woman with trembling hands, she squeezed my fingers and said, "Bless you." I didn't correct her. I didn't explain funding sources or strategic allocations. I simply smiled. That night, alone in my townhouse, I allowed myself a rare indulgence. I opened the secure online portal that tracked my investments. The numbers had grown since I first inherited them. Conservative portfolios had done their quiet work. 12 million had become slightly more. I felt no thrill. Instead, I felt responsibility. My grandfather had been right. Money amplifies who you already are. If I had remained in that engagement, I suspect it would have amplified insecurity, mine and Daniel's. It would have become leverage, a bargaining chip, a distortion of power. Used this way, it felt like infrastructure. Around that time, something unexpected happened. My father called. We weren't estranged, but we weren't close. Our conversations typically hovered around safe topics: weather, work, mutual acquaintances. That evening, his voice carried an unfamiliar hesitation. "I heard from your mother that the wedding didn't happen," he began. "That's right," I replied. He cleared his throat. Are you all right?" The question caught me off guard. "Yes, I am," I said honestly. There was a pause. Then quietly he said, "I've made mistakes in my life, Claire. Stayed in situations longer than I should have. Sometimes stability can feel like the same thing as happiness." His words surprised me. He rarely spoke in reflections. "I'm proud of you," he added. The statement settled into my chest gently. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was real. "Thank you," I said softly. After we hung up, I realized something else the 30 days had revealed. Not all relationships were transactional. Some were simply distant because neither side knew how to bridge the gap. My father's pride didn't depend on my income bracket or marital status. It depended on my courage. At the nonprofit, Thomas, the man we had housed weeks ago, secured part-time employment through our training program. When he came by to tell us, he stood a little straighter. His eyes were clearer. "I won't forget this place," he said. I watched him leave and thought about how easily his life could have slid further into invisibility, how thin the line sometimes is between housed and unhoused, stable and spiraling. I thought about my 30 days. I had chosen them. He had not. That distinction mattered. One evening, Lila asked me a question I hadn't yet fully answered for myself. "Do you ever regret not telling Daniel the truth?" she asked over dinner. I considered it carefully. "If I had told him," I said slowly, "and he'd stayed, I would have always wondered why." She nodded. "And if he'd left anyway, then the money would have meant nothing." Silence stretched comfortably between us. "I needed to know who he was without incentive," I finished. "And?" she asked gently. And I found out. There was no bitterness in my voice, just clarity. As the year turned, winter settled heavily over the city. Snow-lined sidewalks, the maple tree in my front yard stood bare and still. Inside, my townhouse felt warm and lived in. I hosted small dinners occasionally. Lila, Mrs. Alvarez, a few volunteers. Nothing extravagant, just laughter and shared stories. I had stopped thinking of myself as someone who had been homeless for 30 days. Instead, I thought of myself as someone who had tested her own resilience and passed. On the anniversary of the day I first slept in my car, I drove back to that same grocery store parking lot. It wasn't nostalgia, it was remembrance. I parked in nearly the same spot and sat there quietly. Cars moved in and out, shoppers hurried past with routine purchases. No one paid attention to the silver sedan. I remembered the cold, the doubt, the ache in my shoulders, the moment I realized Daniel's silence was louder than any argument. And I felt gratitude, not for the pain, but for the clarity it delivered. I no longer needed to prove my worth through endurance. I no longer mistook acceptance for love. I no longer equated stability with safety. True security, I had learned, wasn't the absence of hardship. It was the confidence that you could survive it without losing yourself. As I drove away from that parking lot, I understood something with complete certainty. The most valuable thing I inherited wasn't $12 million. It was the freedom to walk away and the courage to do it.
By the 23rd day, I stopped counting how many times I had almost broken. I started counting something else instead. Small mercies. A gas station clerk who let me refill my water bottle without buying anything. A woman at the laundromat who gave me dryer sheets because she said, "Baby, you look like you need a little softness." The way the sky in the early morning looked like it had been painted just for people who had nowhere to be. I had been sleeping in my car again, parked near the edge of the beach where the police didn't patrol as often. The ocean was loud at night, like it was arguing with itself. Sometimes I would roll the window down just a crack and let the salt air in, just to remind myself I was still alive. That morning, I woke up to a knock on my window. My heart slammed into my throat. I sat up too fast, disoriented, my neck stiff from the awkward angle of the seat. When I turned my head, I saw a man in a city jacket and a badge hanging around his neck. "Ma'am," he said through the glass, his voice muffled, "you can't sleep here." Of course I couldn't. I rolled the window down slowly. "I'll move," I said. My voice sounded small, smaller than I felt. He looked at me for a long second, not angry, just tired. "Are you okay?" I almost lied. I almost said yes, because pride is a hard habit to break. But something in his face, something human, made the truth slip out. "I'm just between places right now." He nodded, like he'd heard that before. "There's a temporary shelter 2 miles up. They open at 8, if you need it." I thanked him. He stepped back. I started the engine, and as I pulled away, I realized something. If this had happened to me 6 months ago, I would have been furious. I would have called a lawyer. I would have made a complaint about harassment. I would have told myself that people like him were inconveniencing people like me. Now I understood he was just doing his job. Perspective is a ruthless teacher. I didn't go to the shelter, not that day. Instead, I drove to the office of the attorney who had been overseeing my divorce and the trust restructuring. His name was Martin Green. I had hired him years ago when the business first crossed into 8 figures. He was meticulous, precise, cold in a way that felt safe. When I walked into his glass building wearing jeans that hadn't seen an iron in weeks and a blouse that had lost its shape, the receptionist blinked twice before recognizing me. "Mrs. Davenport?" she whispered. "Just Claire," I said softly. Martin saw me immediately. He didn't comment on how I looked. He didn't ask where I'd been. He simply gestured for me to sit. "I've finalized everything you requested," he said, sliding a folder across the desk. "The liquidity transfers, the foundation paperwork, the separation of personal and corporate assets." I nodded. 30 days ago, in a moment of anger and wounded pride, I had told him I wanted to liquidate a significant portion of my holdings. I didn't need $12 million sitting in accounts that cost me my marriage and my sense of self. But I hadn't told him the real reason. I opened the folder and skimmed the documents. Clean, orderly, numbers lined up like obedient soldiers. "Martin," I said carefully, "I want to establish a transitional housing initiative." He looked up. "For women," I continued, "women who are recently displaced, divorced, escaping domestic situations, financially cut off." He leaned back in his chair. "That's a substantial undertaking. I know.
You could donate to an existing nonprofit. I don't want to donate, I want to build it. He studied me for a long moment. Why? I swallowed. Because I slept in my car with a fortune in my name. Because I needed to feel what it meant to have nothing but yourself. Because I never want another woman to feel invisible the way I did. Because I understand something now that I didn't before. Money isn't security, community is. He didn't smile. Martin rarely did, but his eyes softened. I'll begin drafting the structure, he said. When I left that office, something inside me felt aligned. Not healed, not fixed, but pointed in the right direction. The 25th day was the hardest. I don't know why. Nothing catastrophic happened. No confrontations, no threats. Just a heaviness that settled into my bones. I sat in my car in a grocery store parking lot and watched families load bags into their trunks. A little girl dropped a loaf of bread and started crying like the world had ended.
Final part. Moving into that small apartment did not feel like a victory parade. There were no champagne glasses, no congratulatory texts, no dramatic music swelling in the background. It was quiet, almost sacred. I slept on the mattress the first night without sheets because I was too tired to make the bed. And for the first time in 30 days, I stretched out fully without worrying about a knock on the window or a flashlight cutting through the dark. The silence felt different inside four walls. It felt earned. The next morning, I made coffee in a borrowed machine and stood on the balcony watching commuters rush below. Suits, backpacks, phones pressed to ears, everyone moving toward something. For years, I had been one of them, moving from meeting to meeting, from investment to acquisition, always building, always expanding. But I had never stopped long enough to ask myself why I was building or who I was building it for. I had assumed growth meant success. I had assumed comfort meant safety. I had assumed marriage meant permanence. I was wrong about all three. Within a week, the paperwork for the Transitional Housing Initiative was complete. I named it Second 30, not because I planned for women to live there for exactly 30 days, but because 30 days had been long enough to dismantle my illusions and short enough to rebuild my foundation. The program would offer temporary housing, financial literacy workshops, legal aid referrals, and therapy sessions for women navigating sudden displacement, divorce, abandonment, domestic violence, financial sabotage. I had learned that homelessness did not always begin with addiction or unemployment. Sometimes it began with betrayal in a kitchen you once called your own. I toured a modest 3-story building on the edge of downtown with Martin and a property consultant. It needed work. The paint was peeling, the plumbing was outdated, but the bones were solid. 12 individual rooms, a communal kitchen, a small courtyard that could hold potted plants and folding chairs. As I walked through the empty hallway, my footsteps echoed the way they had in my new apartment. Only this time, the echo didn't feel lonely. It felt like possibility. "This could be something powerful," the consultant said. "It will be," I replied. Renovations began within a month. I poured not just money, but attention into every detail. Durable mattresses, lockable storage cabinets, soft lighting instead of harsh fluorescents, a large wooden dining table in the kitchen, community forums over shared meals. I had learned that firsthand. When the first 3 women moved in, I was there to greet them. I didn't introduce myself as a founder or benefactor. I simply said, "My name is Claire. I've slept in my car before. You're safe here." One of them, a woman named Teresa, looked at me with skepticism. She had 2 young sons clutching her coat. "For how long?" she asked. "As long as it takes for you to stand steady again," I answered. Second 30 did not fix everything. It did not erase trauma or restore broken marriages or guarantee high-paying jobs, but it offered breathing room, and sometimes breathing room is the difference between collapse and recovery. Meanwhile, my divorce finalized quietly. There was no courtroom drama, no shouting, just signatures.
When I saw my ex-husband one last time across a polished conference table, he looked older, not physically, spiritually. There was a hollowness in his posture that I recognized because I had carried it once. "He never thought you'd walk away like that," he said, referring to the 30 days. "I didn't walk away," I replied calmly. "I walked towards something." He didn't understand. He didn't have to. Lila visited the apartment 2 weeks later. She stepped inside, glanced around, and smiled. "It feels like you," she said. "Small," I teased. "Grounded," she corrected. We sat on the floor eating takeout noodles, and I told her everything. The car, the shelter line, the knock on the window, the way I had almost lied to the city officer. She listened without judgment, her eyes shining not with pity, but with pride. "I'm glad you found yourself," she said softly. "I just wish you hadn't felt like you had to disappear to do it." Her words settled deep. She was right. Strength does not require self-erasure, but sometimes transformation demands solitude. The key is knowing when to return. Months passed. Second 30 expanded to 2 buildings. Donations began to trickle in from unexpected places, small checks from women who had once stayed there and now had apartments of their own. One mailed $5 with a note that read, "This is what I can give. You gave me space to breathe." I framed that note in my office. People occasionally asked why I had chosen to experience homelessness when I could have rented a luxury suite or stayed at a resort while my life recalibrated. I never answered with drama. I simply said, because comfort would have numbed the lesson. When you have $12 million, the world bends in subtle ways. Doors open, mistakes are softened, consequences are buffered. But when you strip that buffer away, even temporarily, you confront your raw self, the impatient parts, the entitled reflexes, the quiet fears you've drowned in convenience. I learned that I was more adaptable than I believed and more fragile than I admitted. I learned that shame thrives in secrecy and dissolves in shared stories. I learned that wealth can insulate you from community if you let it. On the anniversary of my 30th day, I drove back to the beach where I had once parked at night. I sat in the same spot, windows down, listening to the ocean argue with itself. This time, I wasn't hiding, I was remembering. A young woman was parked 2 spaces away in an aging sedan. She looked exhausted. I recognized the stiffness in her shoulders, the way she kept checking her mirrors. I walked over slowly and knocked on her window. She flinched, then rolled it down a fraction. "Are you okay?" I asked. She hesitated. "I'm just between places," she said. The same words I had used. "I know a place, if you'd like information." I handed her a card for second 30.